All right. Hello, Facebook universe. For the people that are watching pre-recorded, we're waiting for some light people to come on, if they will, because this is a very special. I'm getting very special. It's me. I say, hey, I'm on. Very special episode of Jesus Land. We're not on at 9 a.m. today only. Because this one took a little bit longer to get ready for. This one was a little bit, it's more in depth. It's going to be a little bit of a longer teaching today. So hopefully it'll still be about 45 minutes, but it might be up to an hour. So some of you might want to watch in parts. But to me, it's a very powerful part of the story. And in fact, to be honest with you, I created this teaching for this part a number of years ago. And been waiting for this chance in the book to be part of it. And it's actually part 3 of A Tale of Three Passovers. Real briefly, since we have a ton of stuff to go through today, for those who haven't been watching this and then maybe are joining at this point for tonight, we're going through a book that is being written called Jesus Land. And it's talking about the kingdom of God. And 5 different sections of the book. There's the introduction, the immigration into the kingdom of God, and then talking about the 4 places where we find ourselves. We're in one of these 4 places as we relate to the kingdom of God. And we're either a hostile foreigner, a broken immigrant, a loyal citizen, or a passionate ambassador. And each one of these has a word associated with them. There's will, gospel, king, passion. We talked about will and what the will of God was, what the will of the kingdom of man was. But now we're talking about gospel. Everything in this part of the book is about the broken immigrant and the gospel. And we're getting to the last few chapters of this. We only have 2 more chapters after tonight. Tomorrow we'll be talking about what is a broken immigrant. How do you know if maybe you are a broken immigrant? And what do you do about that if that is where you are in the kingdom? Because we're always called to go deeper and deeper into the kingdom. And then on Monday, we'll finish it up by talking about exactly that. What do you do if you are a broken immigrant? But this is actually part 3, 3 chapters that we're calling The Tale of Three Passovers. We found out Passover 1 was in the book of Luke. It was talking about the first time Jesus cleansed the temple. When he came, when he began his ministry, it began. Oh, wait, here's Christy. I'm on live right now, so want to come say hi to people? And Christy's just coming home from work because she worked so hard. 7 o'clock is return home day. So the first part, come poke your head in. Say hi to the many 4 people that are on right now.
The 4 people.
See you later. All right. Okay, so the first Tale of Three Passover, the first Passover was from the book of John. Jesus at the wedding feast, turning water into wine, and we call that the cosmic joke. Not a joke as in a joke on anybody, but just the humor and joy of God. We also called that whole lesson the sacred and the profane. We found out, really what it is. So I encourage you to go back and find out about that first Passover, which was at the beginning of Jesus' ministry. Then yesterday, we talked about Passover number 2 that happened during the triumphal entry of Jesus into Jerusalem, the king coming into the city for his coronation. And then we found out also about the cursing of the fig tree and what that meant. And that was actually a prophetic utterance, looking both at the parable of the fig tree, and it was an utterance against Jerusalem, but also for us in this season that we're in now. So I encourage you to go back and listen to the Tale of Three Passovers part 1, the Tale of Three Passovers part 2, and then today the dramatic conclusion, the Tale of Three Passovers number 3. We're entitling this one, The Old Has Gone, the New Has Come. It's going to be a little bit of a longer teaching today. We're going to go into a little bit of a history lesson, but for me, anyways, it's been very, very powerful, this lesson over the years. And this is going to be looking at prophecy, looking at Jesus' prophecy during the season. So actually, it's going to pick up where the last one left off. It's going to pick up on Passover 2 as Jesus starts talking about Passover 3, which will be tonight. And a lot of this is prophecy. Now, all taken from the Synoptic Gospels. Remember, the Synoptic Gospels. Kathleen says hi. She says hi back. The Synoptic Gospels are Matthew, Mark, Luke. You know, John kind of tells a different story, a different perspective of the same story, if you will. A beautiful beginning. John chapter 1 itself is just, I can't get through that dry-eyed. But we're going to be telling the stories of Jesus' prophetic utterance and what that means. So we won't look at it, but you can see it through Matthew 24. We've been talking a lot about that. Mark 13, but we're going to focus today on Luke 21, 5 to 28. And they're just three tellings of the same thing. But first of all, we got to set some ground rules. We got to understand how we read and understand biblical prophecy. Because, and you can look at anybody who goes through the book of Revelation or go through studies there and all the different arguments and ways of looking at things, and people get so angry and churches have split and people have been killed and all that just because, you know, one person's premillennial, the other one's postmillennial, one believes in a sneak rapture, one doesn't, one thinks this is translated. So let's set some ground rules as we understand biblical prophecy before we get into this. First of all, we often get bogged down and confused by perceived timelines. In other words, we read a prophecy maybe from the book of Daniel when it talks about, you know, the statue with the head of gold, the feet of clay, and we start wanting to figure out what the timelines of these, especially with Revelation. You'd have things like the Hagee map. John Hagee would put a whole map of Revelation. So it's like, act surprised when you see it, because this is exactly how it's going to be. And the problem is we have so many arguments about that because we get bogged down and confused by timelines. And this is because we are linear creatures that are inside of the realm of time. So we understand and reason and try to get everything to be explained by linear time, but God is not under the same restraint of time. God is outside of time, the creator of time. So that's one thing we get bogged down for, trying to find out and figure out this timeline of every prophecy. Figuring out if you can figure out the start dates and you can figure out the end dates, and then everything sort of got to fit into some there. Secondly, we think of the kingdom of God, it should be a place. We understand kingdoms as physical locations. So we, even though we kind of know that Jesus said, it's not a place where you could say it's over there, it's over there. But we want it to be, you know, a place. It's like heaven. It's there in heaven. So maybe it's Israel. Maybe it's America. Maybe it's our church. We want it to be a physical location, a place we could go. We often think of the kingdom of God also as it needs to come all at once, so we understand it. It's either there or it's not there. But we talked about the already not yet. How it's here. It's here in the fullness. It came with Jesus. But there's more. We love giving that Dallas Willard line. Scott points out all the time. It says, the kingdom of God is more about, I'm paraphrasing, kingdom of God is more about how we live, not just how we're going to live when we die, but what we ought to live in here on earth. We also think that the kingdom of God is a state of being, or an understanding or cognitive reasoning. But reality is the kingdom of God is a person. The kingdom of God is the king, Jesus. When he said the kingdom of God is in your midst, it's because Jesus was in their midst. If you translated the kingdom of God is inside of you, what Jesus said, I am with you always. I am in you, I am in the Father, I am in you, and you are in me. Because the kingdom of God, at the end of it all, is not a place like heaven. It's not a place like America or the church. The kingdom of God is a person. And that person is Jesus. There is no heaven if Jesus isn't there. The kingdom of God is a person. We think prophecy has to be fulfilled all at once, has to be done in a clear, precise way. We get it when it happened. That way it could be predicted, it could be mapped out, it could be understood fully and done by those who are smarter than any others. So you guys might be dumb and thousands of people have tried, but I've got this whole thing figured out. And what humbles us is we use the examples of the messianic prophecy to see all this. There were hundreds, thousands of messianic prophecies all through the Old Testament. And when you look at Jesus, they all culminated in this poor baby born in Bethlehem with the shepherds coming and nobody. People studied these prophecies. They had Pharisees and priests and spent their life memorizing and studying these prophecies, but nobody saw him coming when he came. Okay, except for 3 wise guys that weren't even from that country, from somebody else. They kind of picked up on it. They needed a big star to show them the way. And there's some people that in the temple that God had promised that they wouldn't die until they saw the Messiah. But all this pride and arrogance of understanding biblical prophecy, and it was all right there. But when the Messiah came, nobody was looking in the right direction. But he came nevertheless. So at the end of it, when we look at biblical prophecy, the key word here, humility. Humility. Sometimes, and this is the key point, we're going to look at this today, and different theologians would discuss this and fight this and argue this, just like they will fight, discuss, and argue prophecy. But my point of view, what I am putting before you guys, is saying that biblical prophecy can have dual meaning. So in other words, if you see something, it could have a dual meaning or dual times. It could be out of a timeline and not necessarily pinned down. So something that is said could be like, oh, this is for this time. This was fulfilled here. But it might also have a dual meaning for the end, the return of Christ. So just because something's fulfilled in one time, we often see, some prophecy was about David, but really it was about Jesus. And so it might have dual meaning. So here's the bottom line. We must see the heart of a prophetic word. We must see the heart of what a prophetic word is about in order to understand its purpose and its season. So in other words, you could get lost. You could miss the forest because the trees are in your way. Or you could look back and say, I see the forest and the trees are what make it. Biblical prophecy isn't about figuring all the details out, but understanding what the heart of God is for us to know and prepare and be ready for those seasons. I want to look briefly at Luke 21. We're going to spend more time there, but I want to just catch a little bit first of Luke 21, 29. And we're going to go through the whole thing at the end after I give you a history lesson. But I want you to hear this part, which is a new parable of the fig tree. Yesterday we talked about the fig tree, cursing of the fig tree. Why did he curse a perfectly good fig tree? We went back to learn about the parable of the fig tree, which was a prophetic word against Jerusalem. And this is an example of something that I believe is a dual meaning prophecy. Yes, it was about what we're going to talk about tonight, the parable of the fig tree, but it was also about you and me and the season we're in now and the kingdom of God. But this is a new parable of the fig tree that's just a line or two long, and it's Luke 21, 29, 31. And that says this. In the middle of Jesus' prophecy, he told them a parable right in the middle. He said, look at the fig tree and all the trees. When they sprout leaves, you can see for yourself and know that summer is near. Even so, when you see these things happen, you know that the kingdom of God is near. So he's saying, look at the fig trees. When you see the leaves, you know that it's almost summer. You can understand and recognize the time you're in. Same with when you see the fulfillment of these coming. And the kingdom of God is what's coming instead. It's interesting he talks about the leaves, because we look at yesterday when he was talking about going to the fig tree, he said he went to the fig tree and it wasn't even the season for figs, but it had its leaves because it was springtime, and springtime is when the leaves come out and the fruit hasn't come yet, but it's the sign that it's summer. I'm from Canada, so we always have to roll up the rim to win at Tim Hortons. That was sign that summer was almost there. But here it's the fig trees. Jesus yesterday he saw a tree, fig tree, it had all the leaves on it, so he knew it was the season. But he had a prophetic word that he cursed the fig tree, which went back to, okay, we'll look at yesterday for more of that. So this is the season. So let's go. So that was called understanding prophecy. Now let's get into the next section, which is this: all things must pass away. Luke 21:5-6. I want to read one more thing before we get into this history lesson. Luke 21:5-6. Some of his disciples were remarking about how the temple was adorned with beautiful stones. Jesus was coming out of the temple. It was Passover season, just a few days before Passover. That he had done the triumphal entry. He had cleansed the temple for the second time. And now every day they were going to the temple, and the disciples were like, look at this temple, Jesus. It was the second temple, but the one that Herod had spent many, many years redoing, and it was glorious, and it was beautiful. And the disciples would look at these ornaments and these beautiful craftings, and all these. Some of the disciples were talking about how the temple was adorned with beautiful stones and the gifts dedicated to God. But Jesus said, as for what you see here, the time will come when not one of these stones will be left on another. Every one of them will be thrown down. And this was around 30 to 33 AD. So let's fast forward about 40 years to the day that Jesus said these words. So from 30 to 33 AD, we're going to fast forward 70 AD to that very same day that Jesus said this, for the siege of Jerusalem, otherwise known as the First Jewish-Roman War. So let me give you the setup. 70 AD. Well, let's go back a few years from that. 66 AD for the riot of 66 in Jerusalem. Now, we know during Jesus' time, but the tensions had been growing even more. There was complaints that the Greeks were doing things like sacrificing doves to their own gods outside of the temple as sort of a mockery and irrelevance, mocking the temple. And the Jewish priests and high priests, they were furious because the Romans weren't doing anything. They were letting this go on, and they couldn't really do much for themselves, being occupied. And so there was a lot of tension, just like look at America today, all the tension that is growing because all these things. This was what it was like during this time. The Roman governor had come into the temple. He had taken 17 talents, which was a form of money. Yeah, not that much money, but he took 17 talents from them and claimed they were unpaid taxes. And this infuriated the people because it was an insult. So all these insults were growing, and the Hebrew people, they always resented the Romans. They wanted to have their own freedom. That's why the high priests were trying to return them to the religious ways. So hopefully that God would respond. And things were just boiling over in Jerusalem to the tipping point. The people responded to the governor doing this insult. By mocking him, they would go around town taking up collections for the poor governor that needed 17 talents. So he took it from the temple, from unpaid taxes, and they were mocking him. And then they got stirred up, and people started raiding the Roman garrison. They started killing some of the Roman soldiers, doing night raids and surprise raids on the garrison. And the governor, he had enough of this. So he responded in kind. Governor Florus, he reacted by arresting a number of the city officials. He had many of them beaten, and he had a number of them crucified. But this was illegal because a number of them were Roman citizens, and it was illegal to beat the Roman citizens in this way. Crucified. citizen. So things had just boiled over to the tipping point. So much so that in September of 66, the Jewish nationals and the rebels and the my brain just went blank for the name of some of the rebels, zealots, and the people that were rebellion at that time, it took over, and they stormed the Roman garrison. They overran the Roman garrison in mass, and they took the Romans and they lynched them. They killed them, and they claimed leadership of the city of Jerusalem. King Agrippa II, he fled from Galilee and he left it into the hands of the rebels. He fled to Galilee, leaving Jerusalem in the hands of the rebels and the rebellion, who immediately started to form a provisional government and claimed that sovereign territory of the rebels. So that is what the sep of the city of Jerusalem was going through in 66 AD. Now, of course, Rome was going to have a response to this. So Emperor Nero, he sent out an army to deal with this rebellion. Among those was a rising star general named Titus. Now, Titus himself would go on just a few years later, because of what would happen in the next few months, years and months. He would go on to become emperor himself. So this was a rising great man. But Emperor Nero sent Titus and a few other generals with 60,000 professional Roman soldiers to sweep across Galilee in 70 AD, heading towards Jerusalem to deal with this rebellion. Among them, as part of the way they captured a leader named Josephus, who became, who kind of switched sides, became one of the Roman generals because of his sword side. But Josephus was also a historian, and he's the one that wrote about this whole thing in his book, The War of the Jews. So he had a first-hand account. You could read the first-hand account of Josephus talking about this whole expedition in 70 AD towards Jerusalem. So a lot of this is coming from the writing of Josephus. So they arrived just on the outskirts of Jerusalem, just around in 70 AD. So again, about 40 years later from when Jesus made these prophecies, they arrived in Jerusalem, same time during the Jewish preparation for the Passover. And this is our Passover number 3. So the armies of Rome, the 60,000 soldiers, swept across Galilee and now are arriving to Jerusalem to deal with this rebellion. They arrived just a few days before Passover, the Passover season, which is our Passover number 3, the Tale of 3 Passovers, number 3. Now, during this Passover season, there was an estimation between 200,000 to 300,000 Hebrew people, Jewish people, would flood into Jerusalem for this holiday, this appointment with God. And so the city would swell en masse, with almost 300,000 people coming in to the city for this holy week, this Passover week for them. And this was the season that the Romans arrived. But when they arrived, they didn't chase off all this mass of Hebrew people coming into the holiday. What they did was they helped them. They helped them. They helped the weak and the old and the young. They helped them into the city. They assisted them in every way possible so they could come into the city. Now, the people were anxious to get into the city because they were there. The Romans were there, and they wanted to get behind the walls. They saw the city of Jerusalem as being a safe place, a place where God was going to protect them. So the Romans were helping them in. The people were coming in, and the city just swelled to what Josephus says were, well over 1 million people, but with people that lived there, but with up to 300,000 people coming in for the festival themselves. And the Romans were doing everything they could to help them into the city. And the reason they were doing that is because they knew they were about to lay siege on this city. And the more people, the more overrun that city was, the faster the resources would run out, the faster that people would become desperate, the shorter their siege, but the more vicious their siege of the city would be. So after a few days of helping all the travelers come in, 4 days, so the Romans were motivated, they wanted it to be more effective, but they lacked food and resources. And in the days to come, many would starve and die horrible deaths and horrible conditions because of this. So that was the season they were in. So let's begin the attack and siege of Jerusalem. April 14th, 70 AD, 4 days before Passover, the same period where Jesus looked at the stones of the temple and said, not one of them would remain on the other. 4 days before Passover, 40 years after that time Jesus made that prophecy, the siege of Jerusalem began. The gates were shut, and the Romans laid siege on the city. Now, in an attempt to force God's mercy, the zealots in the city, the ones that wanted all these million-plus people to begin to fight and get angry and be prepared to fight this Roman army, the zealots, what they did is they went to the city's food supply and they destroyed the entire food supply for the city of Jerusalem. Their argument was, if they destroyed the city's food supply, surely God would see his city in peril and need, and he would show mercy and grace and save the city. So they, in an attempt to force God's mercy, they destroyed. But many people think the reality of it, what they were trying to do, is they were trying to make the people become desperate fighters. So they would be prepared to fight off the Romans out of desperation. But that made the situation of the siege of Jerusalem so much worse, with the food supply destroyed. And so the Romans started the siege. They set up 3 legions to surround the city. They began on the western side. They put 3 legions of soldiers, and then a 4th legion on the east side by the Mount of Olives, surrounding the city. And the Mount of Olives, which, by the way, were beginning to bloom as the leaves were getting ready to show them that the summer was almost there. The same time when Jesus saw the fig tree with the leaves but no figs, getting ready for summer. The attack on the 3rd wall began. It began in the west, and it took a few months, and in May, so this began in April, but the next month in May, so 1 month, they were able to breach the outer wall, and they began, or the 3rd wall, and they began on the 2nd wall, which fell shortly after that. All that remained in possession of the rebels was the upper and lower city and the temple, which had their own wall surrounded by that. But by this time, the city was starving, with the food supply destroyed. Josephus in his relation talks about those who had to practice cannibalism, and he ate their own babies, and he told horrific stories of what the people starving to death were doing in that city. And actually, Josephus himself was sent by Titus to be a negotiator, being that he was Jewish himself. They sent him in to negotiate with the people, but it was almost like a movie. It ended with him getting wounded by an arrow, and the zealots launching a surprise attack and almost capturing Titus, who escaped at the last minute. But after this, he was determined that it was time to end this. And so the end game began. The Romans used fire against the temple walls. Now, Josephus, he claimed that Titus had no intention of destroying the temple. I want to bring something up in a second. In his writings, he said what Emperor Titus, he was soon to be emperor, but General Titus was trying to do is he wanted to capture the temple, according to Josephus, and he wanted to convert it into a shrine for the emperor because it was so beautiful. Because Herod just spent all those years making it just a jewel. But many don't believe this. Many believe that he was just covering for him. But Titus had an intention all the time of destroying this temple just out of spite and out of revenge for what the Hebrew people had done. So the assault on the final wall for the upper and lower city and the temple had begun, and they were trying to destroy it by fire. And during this, a stray burning stick thrown by a Roman soldier was thrown into the temple and caught blaze for this temple. And this fire started from one burning stick would shortly grow out of control, burning the very walls and starting to go in to destroy the temple itself, and would further on go into the residential district and cause a massive destruction there. At the same time, finally, in August of 70 AD, the final wall was breached. And I want to read from Josephus's War of the Jews. And this is how he described, translated, of course, that moment when the temple was on fire and the wall was breached. This is how he described the time. As the legions charged in, neither persuasion nor threat could check the impetuousness. Passion alone was in command. So there was a fury of war as the Romans flooded into the city. Crowded together around the entrances, many were trampled by their friends. Many fell among the still hot and smoking ruins of the colonnades and died as miserable as defeated. So the Romans were flooding in, and they were even trampling each other to get inside this. And many Roman soldiers died, being trampled as they were flooding into the city. As they neared the sanctuary, they pretended not to even hear Caesar's commands and urged the men in front to throw as many firebrands. The partisans were no longer in the position of help. Everywhere was slaughter and flight. Most of the victims were peaceful citizens, weak and unarmed, butchered whenever they were caught. Round the altar, the heaps of corpses grew higher and higher, where down the sanctuary steps poured a river of blood, and the bodies of those killed on the top slithered to the bottom. So when they breached that final wall into the temple, it was a massacre. Josephus claims that in the siege and in this final, over 1.1 million people died as the city was just slaughtered. Starvation before that, and the slaughtering after the fact. Many were executed in the days following. Not just rebels, but innocents were just massacred in the streets. From there, almost 100,000 that were left alive would be taken from the city into slavery into Rome. Many become gladiators and having to fight for death there. Slaves even claimed that they used them to build the Colosseum. Josephus claimed that Titus tried to put out this fire, as he said there. He was trying to put it out, but the fury of the Roman soldiers, they wouldn't even listen to his commands. And he'd say that this was just baloney, that he had always intended to destroy the temple. But everything's on fire. There's people being slain left and right. There's blood. The temple that was used to worship God was now covered in bodies, piled up. Blood ran down the stairs. And Titus, during this time, walked into the city and said, before this temple is burned to the ground, I want to see the Holy of Holies myself. And so he walked into the temple, and he talks of his seeing the magnificent splendor of the holy place and the holies of holies as he stood in that holy place as destroyer and victor. The temple then was plundered, and all the priests and all the priests who tried to stop it, and the people who tried to stop it, who put themselves in the way of the Romans destroying and plundering the temple, every one of them was massacred. The high priests were taken prisoner. And over the next while, between the fire and this destruction, not one stone of the temple remained on the other. It was all destroyed. The only thing that remained was the lower part of the western wall of the temple. Titus, after this, returned home to Rome as a hero. He paraded around the city. They had great parades for him, and he brought all the spoils that he took from the temple into the city. He took all the sacred vessels that up to this time, none of this was seen by anybody because it was in the holy place, in the Holy of Holies. None of this was seen by anybody but the priests. And now he's parading them around Rome in this profane parade. Things like the table of the showbread presents, the menorah, the lampstand, the veil were among the things. They issued a coin to the great Titus, and they built the Arch of Titus. It was erected as a celebration for what he did, which you could still see today in Rome, the Arch of Titus. However, when it was time for Titus, who just a few years later would become emperor himself, when it was time for him, from his great victory, the tradition was to receive the wreath of victory, that horseshoe, which Kentucky Derby and places like that, they still use that wreath of victory from this. They would put it on the general's head as a celebration, the wreath of victory, but he refused it. And it is said he refused his victory wreath, and this is why he refused it. He said he was merely serving as an instrument of divine wrath. And he said it this way, that there was no merit vanquishing people forsaken by their God. What had really happened there? See, this was the story of the Ord was gone. But none of this was the heart of God. Luke 21, 5-8 says this. Luke 21, 5-8. Well, we're going to read it all. In fact, we're going to read this prophecy we said could be seen in all the synoptic gospels, but let's take a look at it in light of what we just learned. Some of his disciples were remarking about how the temple was ordained with beautiful stones and with gifts dedicated to God, but Jesus said, as for what you see here, the time will come when not one stone will be left on another, and every one of them would be thrown down, which would begin 40 years from that very moment. Teacher, they asked, when will these things happen? And what will be the sign that they're about to take place? Remember what we talked about prophecy? That some are for this time, some are for the end time, some might be for both. Let's read this in light of that. Jesus replied, watch out that you are not deceived. For many will come in my name, claiming, I am he. And the time is near. Do not follow them. When you hear of wars and revolutions, do not be frightened. At that time, they heard of many wars, many revolutions, 66 AD. These days, we hear of many wars and revolutions. These things must happen, but the end will not come right away. Then he will say, nations will rise against nations, and kingdom against kingdom. There will be great earthquakes, famines, pestilence in various places, and fearful events, and great signs from heaven, as there was in that time, as there is in this time. But before all of this, they would lay hands on you and persecute you. They would deliver you to synagogues and prisons, and you will be, like Paul did, Saul, who took them and persecuted the new church, and how many are persecuted today. And we know even in the days to come. And you'll be brought before kings and governors, and all on account of my name, like Paul was brought before Caesar. And for us today, this could be something we are seeing, or we'll see. This will result in you being witnesses to them. But make up your mind not to worry beforehand for how you will defend yourself. For I will give you word and wisdom, and none of your adversaries will be able to resist or contradict. You will be betrayed even by parents, brothers, relatives, and friends, and they will put some of you to death, as they did the early church, as they still do today, and as they will do in the days to come. All men will hate you because of me, but not a hair of your head will perish. By standing firm, you will gain life. Because the kingdom of God is about life. Okay, you ready? When you see Jerusalem being surrounded by armies, 3 on the western side, 1 by the Mount of Olives on the east, you will know that its desolation is near. Then those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let those in the city get out, and let those in the country neither enter the city. What happened? They were flooding into the city. But what should have happened? He was warning that those who are in Judea flee, not to the city, but to the mountains. Let those in the city get out, and let those in the country not enter the city. Don't enter the city. But many thousands and hundreds of thousands did. For this is the time of punishment, in fulfillment of all that has been written. Remember the siege of Jerusalem? How dreadful it was? The starvation? How dreadful it will be for those days for pregnant women and nursing mothers. There will be great distress in the land and wrath against this people. What did Titus say? He said, I was only serving as an instrument of divine wrath. They will fall by the sword, and they will be taken prisoner. How many fell by the sword when the Romans flooded in? 100,000, almost 100,000, taken prisoner. To all the nations, Jerusalem will be trampled on by the Gentiles until the time of the Gentiles is fulfilled. There will be signs in the sun and moon and stars and on the earth. Nations will be in anguish and perplexity and the roaring and tossing of the seas. Men will faint from terror and apprehension of what is coming to the world, for the heavenly bodies will be shaken. At that time they will see the Son of Man coming in the cloud, power, and great glory. Have we seen that? No. So some of this we could see that was clearly 70 AD. Some of this hasn't happened yet. So maybe some was for then, maybe some is for the future, maybe some for both. When these things begin to take place, stand up, lift up your head, because your redemption draws nigh. He told them this parable. Look, and we read this, look at the fig tree and all the trees. When they sprout leaves, you can see for yourself and know that summer is near. What did he see yesterday? A fig tree with leaves sprouting. No fig yet, because it was spring going into the summer. And when did all this happen? 40 years later to the day, the same season. Even so, when you see these things happening, you know that the kingdom of God is near. I tell you the truth, this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things had happened. And that generation was at its end in 70 AD. So that part is very true to that. But then he keeps going. It's heaven and earth will pass away. My words will never pass away. Be careful, or your hearts will be weighed down by desperation, drunkenness, anxiety of life, and that day will close on you unexpectedly like a trap. For it will come upon all those who live on the face of the earth. And then he keeps going. But I wanna switch over quickly to Matthew 24 and just read the second part of the same story, just done in a different way. And this is what he says. He said, because of the increase of wickedness, the love of most will grow cold. And this is Matthew 24, picking up in 12. But he who stands firm to the end will be saved, and the gospel of the kingdom will be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. He goes on. He says, so when you see standing in the holy place the abomination that causes desolation. What was this abomination that caused desolation? Well, remember when Titus walked into the Holy of Holies? The man in charge of the desolation of Jerusalem, the abomination, was now standing in the holy place. Spoken of through the prophet Daniel, that we don't understand. That those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let no one on a roof go to his house to go down to take anything out of the house. Let no one go to field, go back to get his cloak. How dreadful it will be. And then he goes on. Pray that your flight won't be in winter, that it won't be on the Sabbath. In those days, had they not been cut short, no one would have survived. But for the sake of the elect, the days have been shortened. He goes on. So understanding that, yes, some of that was to be fulfilled, and some of that is yet to be fulfilled. But this was a time that the old was gone and the new was come. We read about the parable of the fig tree in Luke 13, 6-9. It was talking about, let's give it one more year. Let's give it another season of grace. But I want to not end with one more point. So we only got a few more minutes, but I want to read Jesus' heart in this ending. We saw yesterday when he looked at Jerusalem. And I want to read Matthew 23, 33-39. During this season, going into the woes of what's going to happen as he's continuing this prophecy. 33-39, he says this. And he's talking about all these Pharisees and hypocrites and teachers of the law that are leading people astray. And he's just getting angry at them. And he says, you snakes, you brood of vipers, how will you escape being condemned to hell? Therefore, I am sending you prophets and wise men and teachers. Some of them you will kill and crucify. Others you will flog in the synagogue and pursue from town to town. We told the story of the parable Jesus said yesterday about the parable of the vineyard and those who did just this. And he's talking about them and what they were about to do. He goes on in 36. I tell you the truth. All of this will come upon this generation. But then he changes his tune. He says, oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you who killed the prophets, who stoned those who sent to you. How often I have longed to gather your children together as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, but you were not willing. Look, your house is left to you desolate. For I tell you, you will not see me again until you say, blessed is he that comes in the name of the Lord. So this is the season where the old is gone. Some of this, of Jesus' prophecy, some of this was past, was of the past, and it was ushering the end of this old covenant. Some of this is for the future, and will usher in the end of the kingdom of man. Some of it for both. But the bottom line here is this. The old ways of the kingdom of man were coming to an end. And the victory of God's kingdom was coming. This is the gospel. that the new has come. 1 Corinthians 5:17 talks about the old things have passed away. The new has come. The temple that Titus entered, it was empty. By the time he got there, it was empty. Because it was the old thing. It was empty from the moment Jesus said on the cross, "It is finished." At the moment the veil split, God had left the building. Revelation 21:3 says this. I should have marked these, I'm sure. Revelations 23 at the end. I don't have that right, because there is no Revelations 23. It was a text. Revelations 21:3 says this. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, "Now the dwelling of God is with men. And he will live with them, and they will be his people. And God himself will be with them and be their God. He will wipe every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain. For the old order of things has passed away." 70 AD was the ending of the old covenant. The future will be the ending of the kingdom of man. The kingdom of God will stand. Let me end with this one. This is the gospel. This is the good news. It might have been violent. It might have been horrific. The old has passed away. And God's kingdom has once more returned to men. That is the end of part 3 of the tale of 3 Passovers. We'll be back tomorrow morning, 9 a.m. to talk about how do you know if you are broken inward. God bless, guys. Thanks for hanging on to this long, extended special edition of Jesus Land. We'll see you guys tomorrow.